Picture this: a billionaire loses $1 million contract in a single night. His empire crumbles, his pride blinds him, until an unlikely voice rises from the shadows. A secret long ignored is about to change everything, and the last person anyone expected holds the key. The boardroom shimmered with confidence as Richard Kane leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. His voice echoed with arrogance as he boasted about the $1 million contract his company had secured, painting visions of expansion, prestige, and undeniable dominance in the tech world. Around the long, polished table, his executives nodded obediently, some genuinely impressed, others too afraid to question the man who built his empire on ruthlessness. Richard thrived on this, on control, on power, on the sense that nothing could touch him. But fate has a cruel way of turning pride into poison, and his moment of triumph was about to collapse in an instant. The heavy glass doors swung open, and in walked Mr. Harlan, the client whose signature meant wealth and security for Richard's empire. At first, Richard greeted him with the smug ease of a man who believed everything was already in his pocket. But the look on Harlan's face quickly erased his confidence. The room fell silent as Harlan set down a folder on the table, his words sharp as a blade. The contract, he announced, was being withdrawn. There was a flaw, a glaring oversight in Richard's proposal, one so costly it made their entire agreement worthless. Gasps rippled around the table, the sound of pens dropping, chairs shifting uncomfortably. Richard's smile vanished, his jaw tightening as though the room itself had betrayed him. The tension thickened with every passing second, disbelief turning to panic among the executives. Millions of dollars gone, the company's reputation dangling by a thread, investors already whispering about disaster. Thomas Gray, Richard's most loyal partner and COO, leaned forward, his brow furrowed with worry, trying to salvage the moment with calm diplomacy. But Harlan was unshaken, his tone final, his decision irreversible. He refused to risk his fortune on a company too careless to notice such an error. The sting of rejection echoed louder than any applause Richard had ever received. Rage flashed across Richard's face as he slammed his hand against the table, accusing his team of incompetence. His words sliced through the room, declaring every single employee worthless, incapable of matching his vision. The same men and women who had once hung on his every word now shrank under his fury, powerless to defend themselves against his wrath. Pride, after all, had always been his weapon, but now it cut down his own people without mercy. As Richard stormed about the room, spitting accusations, one quiet presence lingered at the edge of the chaos. Ella Dawson, the janitor's daughter, stood in the hallway, waiting patiently for her father to finish his shift. She was not meant to be there, not meant to hear the secrets of billion-dollar failures, but the raised voices carried through the door like thunder. She pressed her back against the wall, listening, her sharp mind catching the details others had overlooked. She had studied problems like these before, though no one in that glittering room knew. To them, she was invisible, just another shadow in the background of greatness. Yet as she listened, her eyes widened with recognition. She could see what Richard had missed, the flaw that had cost him everything. Inside, Richard's fury only grew. He tore off his expensive watch and hurled it onto the table, his voice shaking with both anger and fear. "Do you realize what this means?" he roared. "Do you understand that my empire is crumbling? Years of work destroyed by one mistake." His executives sat in silence, no one daring to speak, for the billionaire's pride allowed no weakness and no advice. Thomas tried once more, his voice steady but cautious, reminding Richard that perhaps a solution could be found, but Richard silenced him with a glare. To admit failure, to ask for help, it was unthinkable for a man who built his fortune on the belief that only he was right. The boardroom, once a place of power, now felt like a tomb. The sound of Richard's heavy footsteps reverberated as he stormed out, the glass doors trembling with the force of his exit. His words, however, lingered in the air, a chilling declaration that left the room frozen in fear. "My empire is collapsing," he thundered, "and unless someone pulls off a miracle, it's over." Outside, in the quiet corner of the hallway, Ella's heart raced as she clutched her notebook to her chest. She was only the janitor's daughter, unnoticed and unimportant, yet she knew she held something Richard Kane could not see. The world inside that boardroom was blinded by arrogance, but she had spotted the truth, a secret that could turn disaster into salvation. And though Richard stormed away in despair, fate had already chosen its unlikely messenger. Richard Kane sat alone in his office, the silence pressing against him like a weight he could not shake. The city skyline stretched beyond the glass windows, but even its glittering lights seemed dull compared to the storm brewing inside his mind. His fists clenched on the armrests of his chair, his pride burning hotter than any fear of financial loss. To the world, Richard was a man untouchable, a billionaire who commanded respect with every word. Yet tonight, he felt exposed, fragile, and dangerously close to ruin. The flaw in his proposal replayed in his mind like a cruel joke, mocking the arrogance he had displayed only hours earlier. Every detail he had overlooked now stood out in bold letters, impossible to erase. He wanted to believe it was someone else's fault, that his employees had failed him, that the client had been too demanding. But deep down, a gnawing voice whispered the truth. This mistake had been his own. The door creaked open softly, and Thomas Gray stepped inside, carrying the heavy air of concern with him. He had been Richard's partner for years, long enough to recognize the danger that pride posed to a man who thrived on control. He approached the desk cautiously, his voice low and steady as he urged Richard to reconsider his approach. "You don't have to face this alone," he said, trying to pierce through the armor of arrogance Richard had built around himself. "There may still be a solution, but you must be willing to listen." Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he dismissed the suggestion with a sharp wave of his hand. "I built this empire without help," he snapped. "Do you think I'll beg for it now? No one is capable of fixing what I created. No one." His voice trembled, not with doubt, but with the desperation of a man who could not bear to admit weakness. Thomas wanted to argue, but he knew resistance would only ignite more rage. He left quietly, leaving Richard to the shadows of his office. That silence did not last long, however, for another presence lingered in the hallway outside. Ella Dawson clutched her notebook against her chest, her heart pounding as she debated whether she had the courage to do the unthinkable. She was not supposed to be there, not supposed to cross the line that separated people like her from people like Richard Kane. But she could not erase the knowledge burning in her mind, the clear understanding of the error that had shattered his deal. She had studied it, analyzed it in her head again and again, and knew she was right. Still, the thought of approaching him felt like standing before a storm. He was a billionaire, and she was just the janitor's daughter. But sometimes the truth refuses to remain silent. When Richard's door opened again, he did not see Thomas this time. Instead, Ella stood there, her eyes steady but cautious, her presence almost ghost-like against the polished walls of wealth. Richard stared at her in disbelief, his lips curling into a bitter laugh. "What could you possibly want?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "A tour of the office you'll never work in? Or perhaps advice from the man whose world you clean up after?" His arrogance was a shield, and he wielded it without mercy. Ella's voice, however, did not tremble as she stepped forward. "I want to show you something," she said softly. Richard leaned back in his chair, amused by her boldness. And what could a janitor's daughter know about billion-dollar deals? He mocked. His words were meant to wound, but Ella did not flinch. She placed her notebook on his desk and opened it, revealing pages filled with calculations, diagrams, and notes scribbled in careful detail. "I studied software engineering," she explained, her tone calm and measured. "I had to leave school because my father couldn't afford the tuition, but I didn't stop learning. I recognized the flaw in your proposal the moment I heard about it. Your system ignores a critical variable. It will never perform under the stress you promised, and that's why Mr. Harlan walked away." Her explanation was precise, her reasoning airtight, leaving no room for doubt. Richard's smirk faltered as he scanned her notes, his eyes widening with each line. She was right. Completely, undeniably right. For the first time in years, Richard Kane was speechless. His pride screamed at him to dismiss her, to tear up the notebook and throw her out of his office. But another part of him, the part that had just watched his empire crack, could not ignore the truth staring back at him. He closed the notebook slowly, his gaze locked on her as though trying to decide if she was real or a figment of his desperation. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice low and reluctant. "So you found the flaw," he admitted. "But finding it is one thing. Fixing it is another. You expect me to believe you can solve what an entire team of experts could not?" His words carried doubt, but beneath them a flicker of curiosity burned. Against his will, he had been forced to listen to the most unlikely whisper of all, the voice of the janitor's daughter. The room was heavy with silence as Richard Kane sat back. His eyes narrowed, his hand resting on Ella Dawson's notebook as if it were something foreign, something impossible. He had dismissed her the moment she walked in, laughed at the audacity of a janitor's daughter daring to offer him advice. But her words had struck with the precision of a blade, leaving no room for denial. She hadn't just noticed the flaw, she had understood it with a depth that none of his engineers had shown. And now, standing there in front of him, she did not waver, as if she knew the weight of what she carried. Richard exhaled sharply, the arrogance in his tone dulled but not gone. "You've pointed out the problem," he said, almost grudgingly. "But solutions are not scribbles on a page. Show me something real or get out of my sight." His words were cold, but there was a flicker of interest behind them, an unwilling acknowledgement that perhaps this girl carried something worth hearing. Ella didn't falter. She reached into her worn canvas bag and pulled out a small, battered laptop, the edges scratched, the keys faded from years of use. It looked out of place on Richard's glossy mahogany desk, like a relic in a palace, but to Ella, it was her lifeline. She opened it, the soft hum of its booting filling the air, and began typing with practiced ease. Richard leaned forward, his skepticism plain on his face, but the more she typed, the more his expression began to shift. On the screen, Ella unveiled a system she had been building in secret, a model she had poured hours into after long nights helping her father clean offices. The program unfolded like a puzzle solved with elegance. Calculations that balanced seamlessly, simulations that anticipated stress points with flawless accuracy, a framework that not only fixed the flaw in Richard's proposal, but improved it tenfold. Richard's breath caught as he watched her navigate the program, her fingers flying over the keys, her voice steady as she explained each feature. This was not the work of an amateur. It was refined, bold, innovative, the kind of breakthrough his company had been searching for, but had failed to discover. "This is impossible," he muttered under his breath, though his eyes betrayed awe. "Why hasn't anyone seen this before?" His gaze shifted to Ella, and for the first time, there was no trace of mockery. There was only curiosity, even a touch of admiration. "Why aren't you already working in this industry? Why are you standing here, the daughter of a janitor, instead of leading teams with ideas like this?" Ella paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. Her eyes softened, and for the first time, the shield she wore cracked enough to reveal the truth beneath. She told him of her father, a man who worked himself to the bone to provide what little he could. She told him of her dream to study computer science, how she had been accepted into a program but had been forced to walk away when the tuition became impossible to afford. She described nights spent scrubbing floors beside her father, then returning home to code on that battered laptop until dawn. Every diagram, every line of code had been born in stolen hours, fueled by determination and the quiet belief that she could still make something of herself, even if the world told her otherwise. Her voice carried no bitterness, only resilience, and it pierced the billionaire's hardened exterior in a way no business rival ever could. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. He simply stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on him harder than any financial loss. He had always measured worth in contracts, figures, and public reputation, but here stood a girl who had been denied every advantage and still managed to build something extraordinary in the shadows. He finally turned back to the screen, testing her system himself, his sharp mind scanning for weaknesses. But each test only proved its strength. The simulations ran smoothly, Every flaw patched with precision, every stress point accounted for. Richard's heartbeat quickened as he realized what he held in his hands. This wasn't just a solution to his lost contract, it was the foundation of something greater. The office door opened quietly, and Thomas Gray stepped in, his eyes widening as he saw the unlikely scene before him. Richard Kane hunched over a worn laptop while Ella Dawson stood at his side. Richard gestured for him to come closer, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the screen. Thomas examined the system, his brows lifting in surprise as he scrolled through the data. Within minutes, his skepticism melted into admiration. He looked at Ella with respect, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "This isn't just a fix, Richard," he said. "This is a revolution. With this, you won't just win back Harlan's contract, you'll win contracts 10 times bigger. This girl has done what your entire division couldn't." Richard leaned back, his eyes lingering on Ella. His empire had been crumbling hours ago, slipping through his fingers like sand. But here was a chance, fragile yet powerful, held in the hands of someone he had once dismissed without thought. His pride wrestled with his desperation, but in the end, the decision was clear. He would gamble everything on this hidden system, on the brilliance of a janitor's daughter. If it failed, his empire would collapse completely. But if it succeeded, it would not only save him, it would change everything. His voice dropped low, almost like a vow whispered to himself. "Then we bet it all," he said, his gaze locked on the glowing screen. The morning of the meeting arrived like a storm waiting to break. Richard Kane sat at the head of the long mahogany conference table, his jaw tight, his mind racing. Every eye in the room watched him, waiting to see if the billionaire who once stood untouchable could repair the ruins of his empire. Across from him, Mr. Harlan adjusted his cufflinks, his expression cool and guarded, his body language speaking of a man who had already made his decision. He had been burned once by Richard's arrogance, and though he had agreed to hear him out one last time, his patience was razor thin. The stakes had never been higher. If this presentation failed, the contract would be gone forever, and with it, Richard's credibility. But this time Richard was not alone. At his side stood Ella Dawson, the janitor's daughter, her modest clothes and nervous stance a sharp contrast to the polished executives filling the room. She looked out of place, yet her quiet confidence carried a weight no one could ignore. Richard cleared his throat, beginning the pitch with the practiced tone of a man used to commanding attention. But instead of relying on his usual bravado, he gestured toward Ella, surprising the board and even more so Mr. Harlan. "Today," Richard said, his voice steady, "I am not the one you need to hear from. The person who holds the answer is standing right here." Murmurs spread through the room, disbelief rippling across the faces of executives who had dismissed her as nothing more than background noise in their glittering halls. Mr. Harlan arched an eyebrow, skepticism clear in his eyes, but gave a small nod for Ella to continue. Ella stepped forward, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened her worn laptop, the same one she had carried through years of late nights and sacrifice. The screen flickered to life, and with it, the program she had built in silence. The room fell still as she began her demonstration, her voice calm and clear. She explained the flaw in the original system, breaking it down into simple terms that left no room for denial. Then she revealed her solution, showing how her model not only corrected the weakness, but enhanced the entire framework. Simulations ran smoothly, graphs aligned with precision, and predictions outshone even the bold promises Richard had once made. At first, Mr. Harlan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But as the demonstration continued, his posture shifted. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing not with doubt, but with focus, studying every line of data that appeared on the screen. The room grew so quiet that the hum of the projector was the only sound. When Ella concluded, closing the laptop softly, the silence lingered. For a heartbeat, no one breathed, as though waiting for judgment to fall. Then, slowly, Mr. Harlan rose from his chair. His face softened, and to the shock of everyone present, he extended his hand. "Consider the contract reinstated," he said firmly. "And not only that, I want an extended partnership. This system is more than I expected. It's visionary." Relief swept through the room like a wave, executives exhaling in disbelief, but no one was more shaken than Richard. He had gambled everything on this moment, and the impossible had happened. The empire he thought lost was saved by the very person he had once mocked. Standing tall, he turned to the board and to Mr. Harlan. "This success," he declared, "belongs to Ella Dawson. Without her, we would not be here today." His words silenced the murmurs, leaving the room stunned. The janitor's daughter, the girl no one noticed, had just been credited publicly by one of the most powerful men in the industry. At the back of the room, unseen by most, Ella's father stood watching. His uniform still smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, his hands rough from years of labor, but his eyes glistened with pride as he saw his daughter standing where no one believed she belonged, her talent shining brighter than the polished glass and steel around her. It was a moment he had dreamed of but never dared to imagine. Richard approached Ella after the meeting, his voice softer than it had ever been. "You've done more than save this company," he said. "You've proven yourself in a way few ever do. From this day forward, you won't be cleaning floors. I want you on my team as a lead innovator, and I'll ensure you finish your education. You deserve it." Ella's breath caught, emotion welling in her chest. The world that had pushed her into the shadows was finally opening its doors. Not because someone gave her pity, but because she had earned it through brilliance, perseverance, and courage. Richard, once blind with pride, had been forced to see that greatness can rise from the most unexpected places. As the executives filed out and the echoes of the meeting faded, Richard stood by the window, his reflection staring back at him. For the first time, he spoke words he had never admitted before. "Brilliance can come from anywhere," he whispered. "Sometimes the greatest secrets are carried by those we overlook." The narrator's voice draws the curtain closed. Never judge someone by where they come from, because one idea, one voice can change everything.